Hey, it's Sam from Folk of All Trades here. I'm in our garden on beautiful Kaurna country, and today I'm going to be talking about spoon carving. A big thanks to Resilient South for supporting this video. That's the cities of Mitcham, Marion, Onkaparinga and Holdfast Bay. So, how do you take something like this down to something like this? Well, that's a hobby that I've been really enjoying for the last 10 years. And so I'm just going to show you how I carve a spoon. This is probably the biggest thing that we've ever tried to fit in a short video. So, you know, obviously coming on a workshop or doing a lot more research before you actually go out and carve a spoon is probably a good idea. I didn't do that, and I think it held me back in my carving, and I nicked my fingers more than I needed to. So, as I say, we're going to be carving a little eating spoon like this, and I actually carved this yesterday out of the same kind of wood. This is fiddlewood, and it's just a branch that a neighbour of mine was pruning. This is kind of the minimum size you'd need for something like that, an eating spoon. And so the first thing to do is to just split it down the middle, because we don't want to include that pith. So I'm just looking at it, there's a couple of little knots that I want to try and avoid. This is a nice clear bit of wood here. So I'm going to split it straight down the middle and use this part of the wood. So I could use my good carving axe to do this, or I could just try and, you know, swing and hopefully I hit the right spot. But what I've found over the years is that actually using an axe just to tap on the back and split that way is a much more controlled cut. So this was the piece I wanted, and it's not looking too bad here. So that's the pith. You can see that little brown line through there. If we included that in the finished spoon, then it would almost certainly crack, which is obviously not something we want to happen. So I've got my carving axe here, which is very sharp. Always a good idea to keep really sharp tools covered with a sheath or something like that, so they don't hurt you or, you know, potentially damage the edge as well. So first thing I'm going to do is just carve some of that pith away, and maybe Danny, I'll get you to stop now and come in and see what I'm doing. You'll be able to see a bit better what I'm doing now. So basically I'm just creating a flat surface. You know, that's a cleft surface where it's just been split apart, but it's much easier to see what's going on if I create a flat. And I'm going to turn the wood a lot to keep the blade away from my hand. So I tend not to go above 2/3 up the wood, and that just helps keep me safe. And I also try and tuck my thumb out of the way as much as possible. And that way, if I accidentally come up too high, then, you know, I might hit the meat of my hand or something rather than a thumb. You really want to be confident about your axe blows and not push it too far, not go too high up the spoon blank. Also a good idea to clear your chips just so they don't kind of clog up the axe and then cause you to misstrike or glance off of it. The higher you hold the axe, the more precision you have, but the less power. And for that reason, I kind of hold it about halfway while I'm doing this process. And you'll notice that I'm doing these little chip cuts, working my way up, and then I come down and I clear away those chips. That's just a really efficient way to remove material. Now, looking at this, there are a couple of little knots there, which is not ideal. You know, the earlier in your spoon carving journey, the more you want to avoid knots. And it may be that we take a bit of wood off of this and we really look at it and we decide, no, we're not going to use it. It's going to be too difficult to carve, but I'm not quite ready to make that call just yet. I'm doing the same thing on the bark side, just removing it down and making two flat surfaces that are kind of opposite each other. Looking at that, that's looking pretty clear here. There's a little knot there, a little knot there, but the spoon I want to carve is only actually that big. I'm using a template, and I think that's a really good idea to use a template or a spoon that you really like, and draw the lines around it rather than just trying to freehand or imagine where the spoon is, particularly while you're learning. I'll just take a little bit more off, see if anything jumps out in terms of knots we want to avoid. And no, I'm pretty happy that we can put the spoon somewhere in there. So I'll get that drawn on now. I prefer to put my spoon looking top down on the bark side. You just get nicer grain patterns, I find. They can be a bit more aesthetically pleasing, but each to their own. Making a template's really easy. You can use milk bottles or a piece of plastic. That makes them last a really long time. Now I'm just going to do a bit of carving and not talk for a little while, and you can see what I do. Now what you saw me do on the other side, I'm going to repeat here. Basically what I'm doing is I'm doing a cut straight across the grain. The grain is running up and down. Kind of try to imagine that the grain is like a bunch of little straws, and we need to cut across them and then split along them. So the reason I'm doing it here at the neck, and I'm making sure that I'm supporting that neck on the side of my block, is that otherwise I could really easily split down the wood and actually cut away the head of the spoon, the bowl of the spoon, which we really don't want to do. Now I've made that kind of cut across the grain, then I can come back here and I can try and cut close down to my line. And when I get to this point, I try and flick, just using the tip of the axe, and just flick that out there. If I go straight down and I hit too hard, then again I'm going to crack down the bowl. Okay, so now working on the front of the bowl there, it's a really good idea, just clear my block, it's a really good idea to basically only move your axe up and down in the same plane, and you move the piece of wood to change the angle of the cut. That just allows you to be a lot more accurate. So I'm going to work back and then slowly rotate. And then when I'm getting really close, I can actually use the axe almost like a knife to take off that little bit more. Now the closer you go with the axe, the less work you need to do later with the knife. And obviously I've got way more wood here than I need, but that's just really helped me in that I've been holding it way out of the way of doing all my cuts. It just makes it a bit easier, particularly when you're learning to start off with that longer piece of wood. So I'm going to do a bit of work on the back now. You've seen I've only worked on these 4 surfaces in order to get to this point. And you know, while I've still got my design there, I'm going to work on the back of the spoon. So at the moment it's pretty blocky. I can start to refine the shape. got a bit excited with the axe there and took a little bit too much off the front. So I may just have to adjust my design a little bit and, you know, tell myself to slow down a bit more next time. So I'll switch to the knife and you can see the different cuts that we use. With the template, I've just adjusted it back ever so slightly because I went a bit too thin there with the axe. And that's just something, yeah, for me to slow down on. All right, ready for the knife. And as I say, ordinarily I would go a little bit further with the axe, but I wanted to show you a few of the different knife cuts. I'm just using a Mora, quite affordable Sloyd knife. You can find them online, they're made in Sweden. And the first thing I tend to do is get rid of some of this material round by the neck, and I use a cut into the neck like that. And a lot of the powerful cuts, or a lot of the cuts in general that we're doing in spoon carving, are just twisting this hand and using this hand to push. And that's true of this other kind of cut as well, where I'm coming down the side of the spoon. And all of these cuts have names. This one's the pull grip. I'm holding it in my hand like that, the knife, and pushing the spoon against my body. I'm just following down as close to my line as I dare. And people feel like, you know, this is quite dangerous, but all of the cuts that I'm going to be showing you that I use, they have a stop, as in the stop is the wood, so it can't travel any further than that. But the stop is also my hand. I physically can't get to my chest when I'm doing that cut. So I just need to make really sure that this hand is not in the way. And another cut I use is a thumb push cut. And again, the thumb is doing a lot of the work, and this hand is not actually doing very much. It's just rotating the blade. So now I've got the neck relatively close. See how I'm turning the spoon a lot? I don't want to start coming back, you know, I might carve down this. I don't want to start coming back in an uncontrolled way like that. I'll turn the spoon and I'll do the same kind of cut coming back. Now this is still way too thick. When you're thinking about designing a spoon, you want the thinnest part in this direction to be the thickest in that direction. You know, this is quite wide here, so it doesn't need to be as thick. So I'm going to follow that taper down. And another cut I really like to use is this chest lever grip. So the knife is pointing towards my thumb and I'm going into open space. So there's no stop on this cut, but I am going into open space. And if I slip, then the knife is just going outwards. So you just need to make sure you're not sitting really close to someone when you do this cut. And I'm actually using this hand quite a lot to pull the spoon through the blade. And this is just doing a little flick like that, little flick of the wrist. I can also use that cut to refine the shape of the spoon bowl itself. And the other kind of cut that I quite often use is this cut here, where I'm basically just squeezing my hand and this thumb is tucked around the corner so the blade can't hit it. If my thumb was here, that would be quite dangerous, but because it's around the other side, it's not. And I tend to use that. That's a really controlled cut for doing really fine amounts of removal, and I use that a bit later on. So I'm just going to carve for a minute. You'll see me use those different cuts that I just described, and then you'll see the spoon slowly get a bit more spoon shaped. The spoon is now at a pretty good stage to switch to hollowing out the bowl. It's not perfectly finished by any means, just roughed out, but I like to do the bowl at this stage, and that just gives me a bit more flexibility later when I come to do my final cuts. Now, I mentioned the spoon knife is sharp on one side. This is a right-handed spoon knife, so the sharp bit is actually on the left side as you look at the tool. And the benefit of that is I'm using my right hand, my dominant hand, to push and control the cut, and then the left hand actually pushes the back of the blade there, and that's where most of the power is coming from. Very similar to those other cuts, and there's a couple of different ways you can do this cut. If you're confident, and it takes a while to build up this confidence, you can just do little cuts where you're just kind of rotating the tool into the wood and bringing up a bit there, and then you can switch it around and go back. The reason I say you want to be confident is if you don't have good control, it's quite easy to hit that big meaty part of the hand, and that's not a great place to get cut. The other way to do it is to kind of tuck your thumb underneath the bowl there and to basically just do that movement where you're scraping across the bowl. And by far the hardest part of the bowl hollowing is the beginning, because you're kind of skidding along flat wood. As soon as you've got a little bit of a divot, it becomes much easier. And the key is just to keep that thumb underneath. As soon as it pops up there, then you're likely to hit it with the spoon knife. They're not very common, spoon knives, so it's one of those things you'll probably have to get online. A lot of good makers are over in Europe or in America. This one is a Ben Orford, which is from the UK. Robin Wood makes a lot of great wood carving tools, axes, knives, and hollowing tools like this spoon knife. And you can get those through Australian suppliers too. I'm just going to do a bit of carving, and you can see I'm just working across the grain mostly at this point, and that doesn't give you a really smooth cut. You ideally want to be going with the grain, but because we're just doing this rough cutting, it doesn't matter so much, and you can see it's becoming much easier to do the hollowing now. I've got a bit of a divot. So I'll just do this for a moment, and you can see how I approach it.
Okay.
Now you can see I've started to cut with the grain, and basically what you want to try and do is, if you imagine this is a clock face, you want to cut from 12 o'clock down to 3 and down to 9, and then from 6 o'clock up to 3 and up to 9. And in that way you're always going with the grain and you're less likely to get tear out. So you can kind of see what's happening here. So I've cut in this direction and then it's kind of bending up, and I could push through that cut, but it'll just kind of tear. So what I really want to do then is turn around and come back the other direction and just meet where that grain direction changes. And so you just keep doing that, working from one end to the other, and you can see this pattern start to emerge where we're actually going down from the bark towards the center, and so we're exposing the growth rings of the spoon. And depending on how you place it within the branch as well, you can get these perfectly concentric circles as well, which can look really nice. But I quite like an offset offset pattern on my spoon bowl. And then finally, once you're just trying to clean up the middle where you can't necessarily match perfectly a cut in that direction and a cut in that direction, especially while the wood is so wet and fresh, I just tend to go across the grain just to clean it up while it dries a little bit. So that's the bowl pretty well roughed out. Now, I can tell how thick it is by actually pinching and using my fingers as a gauge. And so I can see if there's any thick spots or any thin spots. The inside is pretty smooth and consistent at the moment, but the back of the bowl is a little bit lumpy and bumpy. So I can just continue to work, removing bits and pieces until I'm kind of happy with the final shape of the spoon. And a great way to test it is to actually put it in your mouth and see if it's comfortable, because eventually this is going to be an eating spoon, and so you want it to feel really, really comfortable in the mouth. I'm pretty happy with how that's looking in terms of being roughed out now, and I won't take it completely to the finished stage at this point because wet wood is really, really hard to get a consistent, clean, smooth finish on. It tends to be a little bit fluffy because it's got that moisture in it. And the best way to dry it out slowly and hopefully without developing any cracks is actually to put it somewhere like the fridge, or you can wrap it in a plastic bag or a paper bag with some wood shavings that you've created, and that just slows down that moisture loss. Particularly in Australia in summer, I find if you leave something like this out, even though it's been thinned down so much, it may still develop cracks, which is something we want to avoid, having put the work into this that we have. In the fridge is my preferred because it's such a consistent humidity and temperature. I've never had a spoon crack in the fridge, and so I'll probably leave it in there a day or two, just out on the shelf, and then I'll come back and I'll do my final cuts, my very finishing cuts. And so I'll show you that step when it's ready to go. It's now been a couple of days since I finished off this spoon. Well, rough carved it and then put it away in the fridge, and now it's ready to do my final finishing cuts. You might be able to see it's gone much lighter in colour. I've just taken a little bit more off to get it to the shape I want, but I did want to show you getting those final cuts and really making it ready to use. So I'm going to start with the straight knife, and basically what I want to do is go over the entire surface and just make sure it's a really nice clean cut. You may not be able to see, but there's a few areas where it's just a little bit rough, where I've caught the grain in the wrong direction, or it's just flaked out a little bit, and so you can feel that with your fingers. So a really good way to tell, is that area finished, is to run your fingers along it. And of course, when you put it into your mouth, you're gonna notice as well any little catches. We just want to smooth that all out as much as possible. Quite often I'll start at the top of the spoon and just work my way down and do that on both sides, and that way I know I've covered absolutely everything. And you can see there's some kind of little knot here or a change in grain direction, so I just actually need to come back the other way to make sure I get that nice and smooth. One area that beginners have a lot of trouble with is this transition from neck to bowl, and it's always going to be a difficult spot because the grain direction completely changes. So one trick, rather than trying to make that a curve, is to just finish the cut, do what's called a stop cut. So come down here and stop, and then come back the other way and stop, and just try and meet as much as possible. So again, using my clock face, coming from 12 down to 9. And this is another tricky spot where that grain direction changes. So just carefully coming along the side to see how it's looking. One mistake that beginners often make is going too deep with their bowl, either just from an overall design perspective or actually going through the bottom and making a hole. One thing I like to do, as well as checking with my fingers that depth, is to actually hold it up to the sky or getting a torch and seeing if you can see light through it. If you can see a lot of light and it's really bright, then you really need to be careful at that point, and definitely don't go any deeper. But this is feeling really nice now. You can do the mouth check. Feeling pretty good. One thing is that there's a sharp sort of edge all around. So the last thing I tend to do is, just using my knife, I just take off a little sliver. If you can get nice long curls, then that's a good controlled cut. And that just makes it feel a lot more comfortable, and also helps protect it against damage as well. A really sharp edge is more prone to getting damaged, getting knocked off and chipping. Now I'm going to call that finished. It's a perennial problem with spoon carving. How do you know when it's finished? Because I could just keep going and going and refining these facets and getting it smoother and smoother, but at some point you just have to call it done. And so I'm pretty happy with that. It's got a nice overall shape. As I mentioned, that's the thickest part because it's the thinnest in that direction, so it should be really strong and last years and years. I'm just going to show you now how to oil this, which will protect it, and then yeah, it'll be completely done. It's now time to oil the spoon, and you can see it does look very pretty. I think this wood, fiddle wood, it's got those beautiful concentric circles, but it's always the best part of the project when you actually dip it in oil, because it just really brings out all of those colors. So the oil is just raw linseed oil. Really important not to use boiled, because that has turpentine, thinners, petrochemicals, not stuff that's food safe. Whereas this is just 100% raw linseed oil, also known as flax oil. So if you use that in your salad dressings, you can use it on this as well. You don't want to use things like olive oil or vegetable oils because they're non-drying oils, so they never actually cure, and basically what happens is they can go rancid inside the wood. So that's brought out a beautiful bit of color. The only negative to linseed oil is that it can over time make things a little bit yellow. So if you wanted to avoid that, you could use tung oil or walnut oil. So that's the spoon that we've just been carving. I've also got some English cherry that I have to oil, so I just wanted to show you how that looks too. And this is an absolutely stunning little piece. So it just brings out that richness. And I typically put it on pretty thick. This is just some linseed oil, as I say, that I've decanted into a jar to make it easier to dip in. Have it on pretty thick there, and then I use a rag just to wipe off the excess. And really important point with linseed oil is that if you leave a rag soaked in linseed oil scrunched up somewhere, it can spontaneously combust. So after you've used it to do your wiping, it's really important that you hang it up somewhere where it can get a lot of air around it and it's not going to catch fire. Quite rare, but you do hear about it happening. People put a whole bunch of rags soaked in linseed oil in a bucket or something like that, or thrown in a heap, and yeah, not a good situation. So those are both oiled now, and because linseed oil does take a while to dry and to cure, I'll just leave this in an airy spot for at least 3 or 4 weeks, depending on how hot it is and humidity and all that kind of thing. You just want to make sure that it's really nice and cured before you start using it.